The courtroom breathed in quiet tension, the kind that pressed against the chest and made even the smallest sound feel too loud. Wooden benches creaked as people shifted, waiting for the next case to begin. At the center of it all stood a black teenage girl, no older than 17, alone before the judge's bench. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, fingers interlocked as if holding onto something only she could feel. She wore a faded gray hoodie and simple sneakers, their soles scuffed from long walks and longer days. Her hair was pulled back neatly, not to impress, but to stay out of her face. There was nothing about her appearance that drew attention, except that in this room, filled with pressed suits and polished shoes, she didn't seem to belong. Or at least, that's what many silently assumed. Whispers drifted through the benches behind her. "Another kid in trouble," someone muttered. "Probably doesn't even know what's going on," another voice replied. The judge glanced down at the file in front of him, flipping through the pages with visible impatience. He had seen cases like this hundreds of times. Young faces, tired stories, the same predictable endings. Without looking up, he let out a slow sigh, as if already exhausted by her presence. When he finally raised his eyes, they were sharp and measuring, stopping briefly on her hoodie, her shoes, her quiet posture. "Step forward," he said. She did, her footsteps soft against the cold floor. She stood straight, though her shoulders remained relaxed, refusing to shrink under the weight of the room. The judge tilted his head slightly, studying her as one might examine a problem already solved. "Do you understand why you're here today?" he asked, his voice echoing through the chamber. There was a pause, just long enough for a few people to exchange knowing looks. The judge's lips twitched into a faint, almost amused smile, as though he expected confusion or fear. "Yes, Your Honor," the girl answered calmly. Her voice was gentle but clear, carrying no defiance, no desperation. It cut through the room, unexpected in its steadiness. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You realize this is a courtroom," he continued, leaning back slightly. "Not a place for games or misunderstandings." She nodded once, respectfully. "I understand," she said. A soft chuckle escaped the judge, not cruel enough to be called laughter, but dismissive all the same. He closed the file with a tap, already convinced he knew her story before it had even been told. To him, she was another statistic, another lesson to deliver, another reminder of authority. What he didn't notice was her eyes, calm, focused, quietly observant, taking in every detail of the room. The seal behind the bench. The way people judged before listening. The subtle imbalance of power that went unquestioned. As the judge prepared to speak again, the girl stood silently, unshaken. She had walked into this courtroom knowing exactly what awaited her. And she was ready, because sometimes, the moment before judgment is where the truth waits most patiently. The judge's voice filled the courtroom, steady and authoritative, as he began his lecture. He spoke of rules, of consequences, of how young people too often wasted their chances. His words were polished from repetition, delivered without pause, as though he had given the same speech countless times before. To him, this was not a conversation, it was a performance of power. The girl stood quietly as his voice washed over her. She did not interrupt, she did not fidget. Her eyes remained forward, fixed not on the judge himself, but somewhere just beyond him, as if she were listening for something deeper than his words. Each sentence carried an assumption, each pause a conclusion already reached. "You need to understand," the judge continued, tapping his pen against the desk, "that this court exists to teach responsibility. And responsibility begins with knowing your place in society." A few people in the audience nodded. Others barely looked up, their interest fading. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression bored. This case, like so many others, seemed decided before it had truly begun. But the girl absorbed everything in silence. She had learned early in life that reacting too quickly could cost you more than it gained. Silence, when chosen, could be a shield. As the judge spoke, memories flickered through her mind. Nights spent studying under dim lights, mornings filled with doubt, doors closed before she ever reached them. She had been underestimated her entire life. Not because of her abilities, but because of how she looked to those who never bothered to ask. The judge paused, glancing at her again. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" he asked, though his tone suggested he didn't expect much. For a brief moment, the room leaned in. She met his gaze, then gently shook her head. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Her response seemed to confirm what many already believed. A few spectators exchanged looks of quiet judgment. Someone in the back sighed. The judge nodded as if his suspicions had been proven correct. "Very well," he said, scribbling a note. "I hope you're listening carefully. This is how the real world works." As he spoke again, his words grew sharper, less patient. He spoke of discipline, of futures lost, of warnings that went ignored. Yet even then, the girl remained composed. Her breathing was steady, her hands unclenched. She felt no urge to defend herself, not yet. She understood something the courtroom did not. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it waited. When the judge finally leaned back, finishing his speech with a dismissive wave of his hand, the room seemed to exhale. "Unless you suddenly have legal representation," he said dryly, "this matter will be resolved quickly." A faint smile touched the corner of the girl's lips, not from arrogance, but from quiet certainty. The moment she had prepared for was approaching. Every assumption had been made, every judgment delivered, and still, she stood calm. Because strength does not always speak first. Sometimes, it waits for the perfect moment to be heard. For a brief second after the judge's last words, the courtroom hung in suspended silence. The kind of silence that follows a door closing, final and unquestioned. The judge's pen hovered over the page, ready to write an ending he believed was already decided. Then the girl moved. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head. The motion was subtle, but it carried weight, as though something unseen had shifted in the room. Her eyes, steady and clear, met the judge's for the first time without hesitation. "With respect, Your Honor," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried, cutting through the stale air of routine and assumption. The judge looked up, mildly annoyed, as if surprised she had spoken at all. "I am fully aware of why I am here," she continued. "And I must clarify something before this proceeds." A ripple of curiosity passed through the spectators. The prosecutor straightened slightly in his chair, his bored expression flickering into mild interest. The judge frowned. "Clarify what, exactly?" he asked. The girl reached down and lifted a modest backpack from beside her feet. It was worn, ordinary, the kind that invited no second glance. She unzipped it slowly, her movements unhurried, almost ceremonial. From inside, she withdrew a neatly organized folder and stepped closer to the bench. A few quiet chuckles echoed from the back of the room. "This should be good," someone whispered. She placed the folder on the bench and gently opened it, sliding the contents forward so they were clearly visible. Her fingers did not tremble. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "I am a licensed attorney." Laughter broke out, sharp, disbelieving. The judge himself let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "That's enough," he said, irritation creeping into his voice. "This is a courtroom, not a bar. License number 78,421, she continued, undeterred. "Authorized to practice in this state. Verified last month." The laughter died instantly. The judge stopped mid-sentence. His eyes dropped to the documents now resting inches from his hand. The seal, the signatures, the unmistakable formatting. His smile faded as he reached forward, lifting the papers with sudden seriousness. The prosecutor stood up. A murmur spread through the courtroom, confusion turning to shock, shock turning to disbelief. The girl straightened. "I am also a senior partner in a legal ethics review program," she added. "Today, I was assigned to observe courtroom conduct without prior disclosure." The judge's face paled. "I chose to appear without formal attire," she continued gently, "to experience this system as many young defendants do, without assumptions of credibility, without protection." The room was silent now. No whispers, no movement. "I am not here to accuse," she said, her voice softening. "Only to reveal." The judge slowly removed his glasses, his hands unsteady. For the first time, he truly saw her, not as an image, not as a stereotype, but as a mirror. And in that moment, the courtroom realized something profound. The trial had never been hers. The courtroom remained frozen, as if time itself had paused to absorb the weight of the revelation. No one spoke. No one dared to move. The judge stared at the documents in his hands, reading them again, then a third time, hoping, perhaps, that they would somehow change. They did not. Slowly, he set the papers down. The authority he had worn so comfortably only moments before now seemed heavy, unfamiliar. He removed his glasses and placed them beside the file, pressing his fingers briefly against the bridge of his nose. When he looked up again, his eyes were no longer sharp. They were searching. His voice faltered, surprising even himself. He cleared his throat. I owe this court an apology. A quiet gasp moved through the benches. The judge rose from his seat, an action rarely seen, especially in the middle of proceedings. Standing, he appeared older, smaller, less like a figure of judgment and more like a man confronting himself. I have spent years believing I was fair, he continued slowly. That I treated every person before me equally. Today, I learned how easily confidence can become blindness. He turned his gaze to the girl standing before him. I judged you before you spoke. Before I listened, I saw what I expected to see, not who you truly are. The girl listened, her expression calm, open. There was no triumph in her eyes. No satisfaction, only quiet attention. This courtroom, the judge said, gesturing around him, is meant to be a place of justice. But justice without humility is dangerous. His voice cracked slightly. And today, I failed. The prosecutor lowered his eyes. The spectators sat in stunned silence, many feeling an uncomfortable recognition settle in their chests. The judge inhaled deeply. I apologize to you, he said directly to the girl. And to every person who has stood here and felt small under my words. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped forward, not defiantly, but respectfully. Your Honor, she said gently, I did not come here to embarrass you. Her words softened the room. I came because I believe the system can be better, she continued. Not through punishment, but through awareness. Bias is not always loud. Sometimes, it sounds like routine. The judge nodded slowly. When we assume, she added, we stop seeing people. And when we stop seeing people, we stop delivering justice. Something shifted then. Not just in the judge, but in everyone listening. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of separation, but of shared responsibility. I accept your apology, she said quietly. And I respect your willingness to face this moment. The judge exhaled, as though releasing years of unexamined certainty. Thank you, he said. As he returned to his seat, he spoke again, this time with intention. Effective immediately, I will request mandatory bias awareness reviews for my court. A ripple of surprise and approval moved through the room. The girl nodded once. Redemption, after all, does not come from being perfect, but from choosing to change when the truth is revealed. The courtroom slowly returned to motion, but nothing about it felt the same. People rose from their seats quietly, no longer whispering with judgment, but speaking in low, thoughtful tones. What had begun as an ordinary case had ended as a moment of reckoning, one that lingered long after the doors closed. In the weeks that followed, change moved through the system in ways few had expected. The judge kept his word. Training sessions were scheduled. Court staff attended workshops on implicit bias, empathy, and ethical responsibility. The atmosphere shifted, not overnight, but deliberately. Small changes appeared first. Softer language, longer pauses before decisions, questions asked instead of assumptions made. The judge himself was different. He listened more. He interrupted less. When young defendants stood before him, nervous, uncertain, wearing clothes that told stories of struggle, he saw them not as problems to be corrected, but as people to be understood. Each case reminded him of that quiet girl who had stood in silence while the court revealed its own reflection. As for her, she returned to her work without ceremony. She declined interviews. She ignored headlines that tried to turn her into a symbol or a scandal. She believed real impact did not need applause. Instead, she continued entering spaces where fairness mattered most, sometimes in tailored suits, sometimes dressed plainly, always watching, always listening. When asked why she chose that courtroom, she answered simply, because someone needed to see themselves clearly. Her story spread anyway, not through gossip, but through quiet retellings, law students discussing ethics, judges reflecting on power, teachers reminding their classrooms not to judge too quickly. Across borders and cultures, the message resonated. Dignity should never be assumed, and humanity should never be overlooked. For many young people who heard the story, especially those who felt invisible, it became something more than inspiration. It became permission to believe in their worth, to trust their voice, to know that silence did not mean weakness. And in that same courtroom, months later, a new case began. Another teenager stood where she once had. This time, the judge leaned forward, his tone patient. "Tell me your story," he said. That simple invitation echoed louder than any verdict. Because justice, when guided by humility, has the power to heal. Because compassion can transform institutions, one moment at a time. And because sometimes, the most powerful change begins when someone chooses not to fight back, but to teach. The girl never sought to be remembered. But her impact lived on in every fair question asked, every bias challenged, every human seen. And that is how hope works. Quietly, steadily, leaving the world better than it was before.